we are gonna cook spaghetti with veggies today. It's actually not gonna be spaghetti at all, but it is gonna be a spaghetti type sauce. And then tonight we're actually serving it with ramen. So to get everything set up for today, I've got my water boiling back here in our apartment stove setup. It takes forever and a day for water to boil. So definitely if your oven is that way, then get it going because the water can take a while. I've been preheating this pan here. I'm spraying it with some olive oil. And then I have a pound of 90-10 ground beef. And I'm just gonna drop that in. Oh, they did a very good job of wrapping that. And then we're gonna go ahead, wash hands because I touched some of the meat use on the packaging. So we'll go ahead and wash our hands. We want to be really careful of any foodborne illnesses, and hand washing is the best way to take care of that. And then we're going to go ahead and add salt. And it's a pretty good amount of salt. I like to season my meat, and then I will customize the flavoring of the sauce, but the meat is a really good way to impart flavor into the sauce. So it's probably a good teaspoon of salt and pepper. And then I will use a nice sturdy spoon. In this case, when you're using your kitchen utensils, one way to save dishes is that, or dishwashing, is try to use a spoon that you're going to want to be using later on. So what might work great for meat is not going to work great for spaghetti sauce later for scooping it out. And so I'll just go ahead and use my non-optimal tool while I cook the meat so that I have one less utensil to clean later. So I'm going to go ahead and let this brown slightly, but wanting to get it cooked all the way through so that I don't have to worry about it being fully cooked once I've got my sauce ready to rock and roll. Because I realized with other video editing that chopping is really loud, while I was waiting for my stove to preheat earlier, I actually got my vegetables ready ahead of time. You'll see here that we have some minced onions in our family. Remember, we really like small diced, small minced vegetables. So we have minced onions. This is one large onion and a full container or a clamshell of organic kale, some organic onion, of course. And again, we like our vegetables chopped really finely, so this is chopped quite a bit. And I just keep running my knife over the kale, just like this. When you're using your knife skills, I was always taught to hold the knife so that your 2 fingers are on the blade actually, and then the rest is here. When you're looking to purchase a knife, you're wanting to look at the balance of the knife in your hand so that it's comfortable. And then as you're doing your chopping this way, you're keeping your fingers up top, and then you're just rocking the knife back and forth. Grab some of the vegetables, put them back on top, and then you just rock the knife again. And that's how you get your green leafy vegetables really quite more finely chopped. There we go, words, they came. So I have 1 can of crushed tomatoes, 1 large can of crushed tomatoes, and 2 smaller cans of tomato sauce ready to go. And then my water's going and my meat is browning. And really for spaghetti sauce, that's all we're gonna use. We're using essentially a pre-flavored form of the tomato sauce. We're adding some good flavors with our vegetables. And then we have a high quality meat, which is gonna add really that grounding flavor note to the pasta. So I'll be back in a minute. When you have 2 things happening at the same time, prioritize what's coming next. My water is boiling. I could put my pasta in right now. The ramen pasta cooks about 4 minutes in total. So I know my turnaround time on needing to pay attention to the pasta is pretty important. And it also makes a really big difference in the overall flavor of the dish of making sure I get it out on time. I'm also watching my meat right now, and my meat is almost ready to be done. So I'm gonna go ahead and spend my time focusing on my meat right now. I turned off my burner for my water. While it just sits there, it'll be fine. It'll still be really, really hot. When I'm ready to focus on it, I can turn it back on and it'll be super fast to get it going again. My meat, on the other hand, if I focus on my meat and I don't pay attention to my pasta, then I'm gonna end up potentially burning my meat, overcooking my pasta. So limit the number of things happening all at once when it reaches that critical timing. So I mentioned earlier that this is 90-10 meat, but I forgot to tell you what that means. What it means is that it's 90% of a protein and 10% of a fat. Another common type of ground meat is going to be an 80-20 meat. That means 80% protein and 20% fat. We'll often use an 80-20 meat if you're throwing something on the grill. So a burger that you eat out is often going to be an 80-20 meat, and that fat keeps things moist while you're doing a quick cook on the grill. When you're doing something like a sauce, you can go for the 90-10 beef if you want less of that fat feel in your mouth. It'll sort of have a little bit of a slicker feeling in your sauces. So you can choose which percentage of fat and protein ratios you want when you're thinking about the type of meal that you're going to create. So a lot of times people think browning the meat is getting it with a hard shell on it as though you've grilled it. Browning means taking it from pink to tan. So you'll see here that there's no pink left in the meat, and that's really what we're going for food safety. Being that it's a 90-10 meat, there's not a ton of fat in this, but our family does not enjoy the fat feel in our mouth. So I always have, in this case, I have a large soup bowl with paper towels in it. You could also use a plate, and I'm just going to move the ground beef to the paper towel to absorb any fat that might drip off of it. If I were using an 80-20 ratio, when I'm getting my meat out of my pan, I would actually be using my spoon to drain the fat, to leave as much fat in the pan as I could. That way I don't end up with just a soggy paper towel where all the meat is swimming in the fat. Then what I would do if I had a higher fat content in the pot left over, you want to take a leftover soup can or bean can, anything that's metal. You'll have that in your freezer. Once this cools down a little bit, then you would scoop out the fat or pour it very carefully into the metal container. You don't want to use plastic because a hot oil is going to end up melting your plastic. All right, so we have our meat draining. There's not a lot to drain though because it was that 90-10. I'm going to go ahead and spray a little bit more olive oil in my pan, and then I chopped everything on my one cutting board, so again I have to wash less at the end, and I'm just going to scrape my onions into the pot because I want them to get softened. Remember, anytime that you're working with onions, they will not soften when you boil them in a soup or a sauce. You need to pre-soften your onions. So I've got all my onions in my pot, and then just as another reminder, you want to make sure you have enough oil to get those soft faster, and salt also helps the onions get softer. So I'm going to put about a half a teaspoon of salt with my one large onion. Again, we have 1 pound of ground beef, 1 large onion, and 1 clamshell of kale to get our ratios of our meat to our veggies. I just want to give a quick reminder of cautiousness with preparing your pasta. So you do have a pot of boiling water. If you were to pour your pasta from super up high or drop it in from super up high, that's going to splash on you. So when you're putting your pasta in this case we're using the ramen because I need to get it heated up, I'm going to carefully put it in. If you don't want your hand that close to the water, then you can always use a tong, or I could use my pasta spoon. And while that's boiling and getting ready, I'm going to go ahead and set up my space in my sink. So when the pasta is ready, I can immediately go ahead and drain it and rinse it in the sink, and I'm not fumbling at the very end to get everything ready. So you want to cook your pasta to the package directions less a minute or two. And the way to test if your pasta is cooked is to grab a little bit, run cold water over it on your strainer, and then you can see this actually isn't bending super easily. So that already tells me it's at least al dente, maybe more. And then just taste it. So it's actually pretty good because you want it to have a little bit of tooth, al dente, so that when you mix it with your pasta sauce, it doesn't just turn into mush and dissolve. So to strain this, I'm going to get it off, hopefully, off my fork. That's my fork here. Know if your cooking ware gets hot or not. And then I'm going to pour it into an appropriately sized strainer. So if it was a big pasta, I could use a strainer that had really big holes. This is ramen, which is a really thin pasta. Angel hair would also be a really thin pasta. And you would obviously not want to use a great big colander for that, or a colander with great big holes, because it's just going to slide right through the holes. If you're using a gluten-free pasta, which this ramen is a millet and rice grain pasta, you always want to thoroughly rinse the pasta in cold water. Otherwise, it just turns into a ball of glue. There's nothing you can do with it once it's totally glued itself up. So you want to make sure that you thoroughly rinse it until the water is clear. And that's how you get the starch off so that it doesn't turn into glue. It is still going to attach itself as it sits in the colander waiting for you to do something with it. That though is easy. You just run some cold water over it again right before you go to use your pasta, and it won't get sticky. And then of course, once it's in the sauce, you won't have an issue with it. So this is just gonna sit here and wait while I finish up my sauce. My onions should be almost soft. So I'm gonna check those and I'll be right back. Okay, so our onions are soft. It took way more than what the television cooking shows always tell me it's gonna take. They say 5 minutes, and my onions never soften that quickly. So you just gotta keep tasting them until they're soft. I'm now gonna go ahead and add in my ground beef and my kale. And I'm just gonna go ahead and get my kale in here. All right, okay, so I've got my onions, I've got my kale, I've got my meat. Now all I need to do, oops, that smells good all together. Now all I need to do is add my canned goods. So again, notice how I did not pour from up here for it to splatter everywhere. I dipped it low into the pot. I'm going to go ahead and use a scraper so that it's quieter. And then I am going to check my ratio real fast. So just carefully stirring so I don't splash it everywhere. So I indeed do want this third can. Notice again, I reached into the pot so that I was not splashing up on myself. If you do struggle with making messes in the kitchen, I highly recommend an apron. I should actually have one on because I make horrible messes in the kitchen. All right, so we're gonna add some salt, we're gonna add some pepper, and this is where you can experiment with other spices. If you like basil, you could add some basil. Oregano would be good. Thyme goes really well with this type of sauce. The other ingredient that you may want to consider is maple syrup. Sometimes the acidity level in the canned tomatoes is pretty high. If you were to get an Italian tomato, a San Marzano, I think is how you pronounce that, they tend to be a lot sweeter and not have the acid that our American tomatoes tend to have. I usually like the pre-done sauces because that's just an extra step that I have to do to prep the canned whole tomato. And so I'll use a regular tomato sauce and then I'll taste it to see how acidic the batch was. If I need to tone down that acid profile, then I'll just add a little bit of maple syrup at a time until I get it to the flavoring that I like. You also could have added some garlic in this. Remember, if you're gonna use garlic, you want to have that pre-done on your cutting board sitting for about 10 minutes to really get the huge powerhouse of the nutrients that you can get from garlic. You might use probably just 1 large clove or 2 small cloves in this size of a sauce. Just add your other seasonings to what you like, but taste it as you go. You don't want to add a tablespoon of oregano and then discover that you don't actually like oregano. So add a little bit at a time and taste it as you go to see what you like and when it reaches the amount of being done with your extra spices. All right, so your dad asked me why sometimes I keep pasta water and sometimes I don't keep pasta water. In this case, I did not keep pasta water. The reason is the type of sauce that we're cooking. So in a tomato sauce, I usually don't keep the pasta water because it already has a lot of flavor to it. It's already liquid. If I need to add any extra liquid because it's a little bit thick, I can just put water in a can or grab a cube of chicken broth from the freezer to give the sauce a little bit more looseness to it. If I'm cooking something like a carbonara though, that is when we definitely want to pull the pasta water aside. And so what you'll do is take a mug. The best way I found to do it is to take a mug, you're going to dip it into your pasta water and keep your mug off to the side. The reason you would use pasta water instead of water in some pasta recipes is because you need the pasta to have more fluidity, the sauce to have more fluidity, but you don't want to water down your flavors. So you use the pasta water to take the starch from the pasta that has the flavoring to it, and then you will try not to get splashed on, and then you'll combine that with your eggs or your cheeses or some other base as opposed to a tomato base to get your pasta to stick with its sauce. Your dad also asked if it was an old wives' tale that adding pasta water to your sauce helps your pasta and your sauce stick together. That's really true, especially with a gluten pasta. In this case though, we're using a rice millet pasta, and so that doesn't really matter, I've found, in the gluten-free pastas. Okay, so if you had used a regular spaghetti or a penne pasta that we like from Trader Joe's, then you would have cooked a pound of pasta. But remember, we like our ratios to be heavier in sauce and a little bit less in pasta. If you eat a ton of the pasta, that's not going to sustain you very long because it doesn't have enough protein for you. So you're going to slowly add your pasta amount until you get the ratio right. It's still going to be a little soupy in the pot because that pasta is then going to absorb some of that sauce. You'll end up with leftovers that way. In this situation, because we're trying to use up our ramen, I'm not going to put the ramen, that really thin pasta, into the sauce and let it stay in the refrigerator for a couple days, because a thin ramen or an angel hair is just going to dissolve in the sauce. So we're going to actually use our bowl, plate from the pasta, put our sauce on to get our ratios just right. Now remember, the best way to cook is to cook once and eat many, many times off of it. So in this situation, I cooked enough ramen for us to have a couple meals with some leftover sauce, but there's enough sauce to actually also go in our super cubes. Super cubes are fantastic. They extend your cooking significantly. So I'll use one of the 2-cup super cubes, put 2 cups worth of sauce in here, and then that'll give Dad and I some quick leftovers where next time all we have to do is defrost it in the microwave, cook some pasta, and we've got a meal quick out of the freezer. Okay, we're gonna put some Parmesan on this, or if you're still trying to avoid your cow's dairy, you're gonna find some grated Pecorino Romano. Remember, the best place for that is typically Costco, and the Parmesan we like to get at Whole Foods. All right, thanks for cooking with me. Love you, bye.